And I think that being must be one, so there are no particulars. Being must be perfect, so there's no room for imperfection. You see, being is static. Being is eternal. Being is all. How in the world could you argue with someone who didn't believe in individuals? He didn't believe in motion. He said, the permanent is what is really real. Movement, change, is illusion. You say, well, that's silly. Who would ever believe that? Have you ever heard of the Christian Science Church? Have you ever heard of science of the mind? Have you ever heard of Hinduism? Have you ever heard of Buddhism? You see, the heart and soul of the Western tradition, which started with Parmenides, is what is called absolute idealism. Absolute idealism is that form of rationalism which says, reality will correspond to what I think it is, and I don't care what happens in the outside world. In Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy said, there is no pain. Now, why do you suppose she said there is no pain? Well, if all is God, and God is good, all is good. There can be no evil. So Christian Science says there is no evil. Guess what Hinduism and Zen Buddhism says? There's no evil. There's no pain. There's no death. As a matter of fact, if you study closely Eastern philosophy, what you find them saying is this: reality as you experience it is illusion. It is a papier-mâché world. It doesn't really exist. It only appears that people grow old and die. Reality is illusion, and you see, the way to get in touch with reality is to climb in your mind by way of meditation. Now, the people who take drugs take the shortcut. Instead of seeking reality by going out and working with their hands, or instead of sitting in the lotus position and meditating and hoping somehow to withdraw from the reality we experience into the true reality which is in the mind, some people take drugs and they say, wow, man, this is reality. Having dealt for 2 years with people involved in the drug culture, people telling me, hey, man, you don't understand what reality is. You don't understand. We are all musical notes in a score. One guy from Juilliard, he said, when I get high, man, I see myself running up and down. I'm part of a Bach cantata. We're all parts of music. And you have people who think they're Superman and leaped out of windows and tried to stop cars, and people who, this woman who fried her baby in cooking oil. And you have people, you see, who say, well, who could have ever believed Parmenides? There are millions of people who believe what Parmenides taught. Reality will correspond to what's in my head. And I rationally think there is only one, and it's perfect and static and eternal. Thus, you deal with Christian Science, you deal with all of your Christ consciousness, the Universal Life Church, unity. What do they say? Ultimate reality is one. That's the Baha'i faith. Not many, one. What is one is good. So is there any evil in the world? No. Is there death? No. Is there division? No. The greatest problem, according to modern forms of this philosophy, the greatest problem is you think you're somebody when you're nothing. You do not exist, but you think you do. That's your problem. And happiness arrives when you finally no longer think that you exist. What can you say to these forms, to Parmenides, or what could you say to Christian Science or unity? Well, you say three things. Number one, absolute idealism does not correspond to experience. And experience is the final test for all theories. For there is nothing else which is capable of testing itself. Only experience can test whether or not an idea holds any water. So, for example, Mary Baker Eddy of the Christian Scientists, who said there is no pain, toward the end of her life, became addicted to morphine because of the extreme pain that she felt in her body. She told her followers, don't go to physicians. She herself went in the dead of the night. She also went to a dentist and had her teeth fixed when she told her followers not to get their teeth fixed. She who said there was no death died. The immediate leadership was so embarrassed by this, they put a mannequin in her carriage and rode around the city of Boston for 3 days with the mannequin dressed up as if it was Mary Baker Eddy, with Mary Baker Eddy in a coffin waiting for her to be resurrected the third day. When she didn't come back to life, they buried her with a live phone, waiting for her to call up saying, "Get me out of here!" She never called. The phone has since been disconnected. But you say, reality and experience is very hard. One philosopher was trying to deal with someone who was an idealist, and he simply said, now you're telling me there is no such thing as pain. That's right. Then you will not object if I do this. And he reached over to a kettle of boiling water and proceeded to say, I'm pouring it on your head. The guy changed philosophy instantly. That'll hurt! He said, wait a second. There is no such thing as pain. The second thing you have to point out is that the God of the idealists is less than what you and I are. When you deal with all these forms of pantheism, they ultimately say God is an it. If God is the sum total of what exists, they call it the cosmic energy. If God is an it is always less than someone who is a cognitive ego, someone who can say, I am, someone who is conscious of their own existence. It does not even know it is around. Someone who thinks, who can say, I am, I think, I desire, I love, I know, is better than it, regardless of what it is. Thirdly, and this is perhaps the greatest problem the idealists have ever had, if everything is one, if all is perfect, all is God, and all is good, where did the ideas come from, such as the idea of evil, the idea of imperfection, the idea of chaos, the idea of movement, the idea of change? If all is God, and God is good, and all is good, then there could not be the idea of evil. Where did the idea of evil come from? I have a friend who has started one of these, she calls it the Universal Mind Church. She started in New York City. And I was talking with me, and she was giving her old line, all is good, all is God, God is all is good. Rhyming. I said, there is no evil. She said, yes, there is no evil. I said, now there's my 3-year-old daughter. You mean if a man raped her and cut her into 1,000 pieces, you're going to chant, all is good, God is all, God is good? She said, yes. I said, there's no evil. Then what happened at Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and Dachau was all right. She said, well, I wouldn't say that. She was Jewish in her background. And I would say, well, that's what you're saying. If there is no evil, then Hitler was not evil. And I said, let me ask you this question. You and I are discussing evil. Evidently, you have an idea of what I'm talking about. She said, yes. I said, where did the idea of evil come from? You cannot have the idea of evil, the idea of imperfection, the idea of degeneration, the idea of sin, if all is good. In a Venn diagram, if you say all that exists from beginning to end is God, and all is good and all is perfection, then you can't have ideas of evil and imperfection in a world in which everything is good. He said, well, I deny that the idea of evil exists. I said, even to deny it, you've got to discuss it. You cannot deny it without admitting its existence. This is the greatest problem, of course, with all forms of idealism. be it Zen Buddhism, be it various forms, even some modern Japanese forms of different forms of Zen Buddhism. They deny that what you experience in the world is real. And it's an escape from reality. It's escape from reason. And you're to get in your head, and all they're doing is going back to people like Parmenides. This is why Alfred North Whitehead said, the whole of philosophy is nothing but a footnote. They are not saying anything more than what Parmenides said back in the 5th, 6th century BC. Now, there was another guy living at the same time who looked at Parmenides and said, this guy is crackers. This guy is absolutely absurd, sitting over in his hut, thinking that with his brain, he could come up with what reality is, and it doesn't matter what he experiences in the world. Reality will always correspond to his mind. That guy is nuts. This was a man by the name of Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is known to be the father of empiricism and skepticism. The father of empiricism and skepticism. Now, here's where you see you're beginning to have the division. Parmenides said, everything that's true begins in the mind and revolves in the mind. You don't need anything outside of the mind. You have it all in your head. Parmenides, Heraclitus came along and said, hey, if you want to know what knowledge is related strictly to the senses, strictly to the world in which you feel things. If you see it, you know it. If you can taste it, if you can touch it, if you can kick it. So he said, knowledge does not come by way of the mind, but by way of the senses, your 5 senses, touch and taste and hear and feel. And you see, empiricism is the idea of this. If something cannot be empirically experienced, don't talk to me about it. I'm not interested. You want to talk about God? Show me God. Bring me a pound of God. You can't? Don't talk to me about it. You can talk to me about a dog. You can bring me a dog, but you can't bring me God. And you see, the empiricist reduces knowledge to only those things which can be experienced through the 5 senses of man. You say, well, who would believe that sort of getting a little extreme? Well, on the left bank of Paris, you have those who will tell you there is no such thing as love. Can you bring me a pound of love? There is no such thing as love. There's no such thing as hope. There's no such thing as significance or meaning. All that you know is that which you can taste and touch and feel. Now, Heraclitus went further. He said that as he walked around in the world, he saw that there is no such thing as being. Now, you see, Parmenides started out with being. Heraclitus says there is no such thing as being. It's ridiculous. One perfect, eternal, and this crazy thing that Parmenides is talking about doesn't exist. I live in the real world. Everything's in the state of changing. Nothing remains the same. So he's the one who made the famous statement, no one puts 2 feet in the same river. Now, why do you suppose he said that? Well, you put 1 foot in the river, and by the time you put your other foot, has the water moved, and is it a different river? Yeah! He said all is flux. All is completely, constantly changing. Everything is changing. This guy said everything was permanent. This guy said they were absolutes. This guy said there's nothing but relative statements. Everything is changing. So he said, anytime you seemingly bump against something that seems to be permanent, it is illusion. Change is what is real. Permanence is that which is illusion. Heraclitus became the father of skepticism for the very simple reason that once you reduce knowledge to the senses, you find that the senses are not trustworthy. You hence end up with no knowledge. And your skeptics argued this way. Number one, no knowledge is certain, or there is no such thing as certain knowledge. You don't know anything for certain. The way that they wanted to prove this was very simple. They said the senses do not give certain knowledge. This was their proof. No knowledge is certain. So you have to say you don't believe in anything. The way that they prove it is that the senses do not give certain knowledge. How did they know that? They said, look, this is the illustration they all used. If you put an oar, you're in a boat out in a pond, and you put the oar in the water, what does the oar look like? Any of you ever look at an oar in the water? It looks like it's bent. A modern illustration. You're driving down a tar road on a hot summer day, and you look ahead of you and you see a puddle of water on the road. When you get there, was there any puddle of water? Can your senses be deceived? Are there such things as illusions? What is a holograph? I went to the Holographic Museum of New York City. You can make a hologram. You can make a three-dimensional image in the air that's not really there. Fascinating. Now, the idealists used this at the Christian Science Pavilion at the World's Fair in '65. They built a holographic rock, and you run in the room, and here was a stand, and on it was a rock, and you put your hand through it, and the rock isn't there. Now, of course, what did they mean by that? No rocks are there. Nothing is there. All is illusion, you see. But you see, this guy is saying, hey, senses do not give any certain knowledge. They can be deceived. Now, the problem we have to face is this, is number one, this person is assuming that the only way to have knowledge is through the senses. That's the only way you can know anything, is if you experience it. Number two, they realize that senses do not give any certain knowledge, so then this actually is the conclusion and not the premise. They began with the assumption only through the senses is there knowledge. They then recognizes the senses can lead you astray, therefore they don't know anything. Well, what can you say? Number one, they were very certain about the fact that there was no certain knowledge. That's self-refuting. Someone says, oh, absolutely, there can be no certain knowledge. I said, now, are you very certain about that? Absolutely. Like someone that says, there are no absolutes. And I said, now, are you absolutely sure? And they said, yes. I said, well, then you've just given me an absolute. You just given me certain knowledge. You're saying that there is a certitude about this statement. Secondly, if the senses are not reliable, how can they appeal to the senses to prove that the senses are not reliable? If you use the senses, such as the oar in the water, to prove something, are you not tacitly admitting that the use of the senses is valid if you used it to try to prove your own position? So you cannot use that which you seek to disprove. You have refuted yourself. And neither can you make a statement which is self-destructive, such as the idea that no certain knowledge is possible, and they are very certain about it. So you ended up with these two basic philosophies in Greek. On one hand, rationalism, which led to idealism, which absolutely cut you off from reality. So here's your rationalism, which leads to idealism. And then you had empiricism, which led to skepticism. And you had those who lined up on this side and those who lined up on that side. The history of philosophy from that day since is simply a discussion of those who have tried to reconcile these two positions. Every great philosopher whose name has gone down in the history of philosophy was noted because this person tried to put these two things together in one system. Well, for example, Socrates, through Plato, said very simply, ultimate reality is to be understood as mind and as matter. And he said, instead of seeing these two things as contradicting each other, I'm simply going to put the two together in a sandwich. There is matter and there is mind. Both things are true. And an understanding of the world will see that the world is composed of these two things. What is mind? He used the word own, which is the word for being. Now this is what Parmenides had talked about all along. What is matter? Here he used the word meon, which is the word for non-being. That tells you what he thinks of matter as non-reality, non-being. But he put the two together, and he said, now the way to reconcile them is simply put the two together and proclaim it one system. What is mine? Never matter. What is matter? Never mine. And he would define each one as being that which is not the other. So what is matter? That which does not belong to mind. What is mind? That which is not matter, that which is non-being. And you see, Plato ultimately fell into the idealism which said that the world of ideas, that is what is really real. This, he ultimately seemed to indicate, ended in illusion. So Plato, you see, had this dichotomy. There was matter, formless, meaningless, without significance, a mere blob, actually non-being, and mind, which had to do with the ideas. But see, it echoed right back with the two original philosophers. Along came Aristotle, and Aristotle pointed out that Plato had made a very, very bad mistake. See, Plato had said, what's this? The person said, well, that's a chair. No, that's not a chair. This simply is the idea of chairness. Up in the world of idea, which is one eternal, changeless being, there is the idea of a chair, the idea of chairness. The object you have over there is a meaningless blob. It is simply matter, has no shape, no form, no meaning. It is matter. Up here is where you really have reality. You have the idea of chairness. Now, what Aristotle said was, how can this be a philosophic answer when all he did was shuffle the furniture upstairs? In order to explain the meaning of this object, he simply said it existed up here. Well, how does that solve anything to simply shuttle the furniture upstairs, said Aristotle. That doesn't explain anything. So Aristotle said, hey, let's get rid of the idea of the world of ideas. Let's get rid of the idea that you know it all, and that was Socrates' position. You pre-existed and you know everything, which again was Parmenides. Instead, when you look at this object, you realize this object is composed of two things. There is a form, then there is essence. And you see, the form is the outward expression. It looks like a chair. The essence has to do with being able to grasp the essence of this object, to understand what it really is. So we said that reality should be understood not with a world of ideas up there, but instead in the object right there. So you've got to look into and grasp the essence. That very expression, grasping the essence, comes out of Aristotle. Getting this seminal idea, all that business comes out of Aristotle. So here you have Plato, who says, you want to understand what this thing is for meaning? Look upstairs to the world of ideas. Along comes Aristotle and says, no, that's not right. If you want to know the meaning of something, then you've got to grasp the essence of it, which again is an idea. An idea. And Aristotle, of course, spent all his time trying to develop how to do this. but you have the distinction between essence and form. The Middle Ages saw a return to the dichotomistic thought by a man by the name of Aquinas. Now, Aquinas said it's not issue of looking up there, but I think that Aristotle is true, except that we're going to rename this and talk about reality in terms of nature and in terms of grace. So you would say there's some things we know from nature, there's some things we know from grace. Reality must be understood in terms of this dichotomy, which is built on this dichotomy. The form has to do with the nature, the essence has to do with the grace. And that's the way you must understand reality. During the Renaissance, after they threw out Christianity, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, let's get rid of grace, and said, we'll talk about freedom. He's the one who developed the myth of the noble savage. He said, if you want to deal with man, you must deal with nature and you must deal with freedom. He said, on this level, we are all machines. There is no such thing as free will. But there is free will, and the two work together somehow to form one reality. So he developed the idea, the more primitive the person, the greater beauty, the myth of the noble savage. And so you have Gauguin and the others who ran to Hawaii. They ran to the islands because of what Rousseau said, that the more primitive the person, the more free they are, when actually the more enslaved they were. But you see, he simply dropped out grace and named it freedom, but he still kept this idea that everything can be understood as belonging to freedom or belonging to nature. Then the Age of Enlightenment saw the development of the dichotomy in the philosophy of one great man, and that man is Immanuel Kant. He is usually called the great watershed of philosophy because he was the next stage of development. With Plato said, you want to understand this chair? Look up to the world of ideas, and that's where you will find meaning. That's where meaning is going to be. Then Aristotle said, no. Look into the object. That's where you're going to get the meaning. But you see, meaning was still in the object. Along came Immanuel Kant, and Kant said, hey, wait a second. It's not up there, and it's not in there. Meaning is in your mind. This thing over here, you don't know what it is. Immanuel Kant said, everything we know about reality is in the brain. Is this the cushion that you are seated on up here? It's a blue cushion. Now, is the blueness in the cushion or only in your brain? He said the fact that they're colorblind people revealed that the blueness is only in your brain and not in the cushion. So we developed the fact, he said, that in the brain you had several things. You had these disconnected, infinite number of confusing impressions coming towards your eyes, coming toward your senses. You know nothing of the outside world. In the first part, space and time are added to the object. Your mind contributes space and time. His proof? You look at this podium and you see how big it is. You move back 50 feet, and then how big does this podium look? Does the podium look smaller? But is the podium smaller because you move back 50 feet? He said, well, you see, your mind is what makes size. Space is something your mind makes up. It is not in the object. And then time, he said, does it seem like time flies sometimes? Sometimes time is dragging? Time is added by the mind. And then he had 14 categories: weight, texture, color, length, breadth. 14 things that he said, all of these things are in your mind. So meaning, he said, it's not up here, it's not in there, it's in the mind. It's the only place you have meaning. It's all in your head, baby. That's where you have it. Because of this, he developed a dichotomy between noumenal, which had to do with science, knowledge, measurement of the world, and then his phenomenal had to do with things that merely came from the mind, which was his next thing, such as God did not come by way of the sense perception, the concept of the soul did not come that way, the concept of the world as a whole could not have come that way, and he has various things up in the upper story that did not come by way of experience, that did not come by way of the 14 categories of understanding, but they're ideas that develop in the soul independent of reality. This is called the sensibilia, where space and time were added to these impressions. This is called the understanding, the 14 categories, and this is called reason, where he developed the concept of God. Now, because Kant developed this basic dichotomy, German liberal theology followed it by saying there's a distinction between knowledge and belief, between facts and faith, between science and religion, between truth and myth, and both are true at the same time. So neo-Orthodox theologians such as Karl Barth carried on the dichotomy tradition by saying that the Bible and all of life must be interpreted as either referring to history or superhistory. In the German, it's Historia or Heilgeschichte. Historia or history has to do with the real world which we experience. He said the Bible was Heilgeschichte or superhistory. In other words, everyone would live with sort of a schizophrenic mentality. So you'd say, Karl Barth, do you believe in the virgin birth? He said, are you asking in terms of history? No. Are you asking in terms of superhistory? Yes. So now, wait a second. You're saying no, it wasn't a biological fact, but yes, you believe it as a superhistory. Is superhistory something that historians can find? No. Well, what is the Bible? Phenomenal Heilgeschichte, superhistory. Well, then I can disprove the Bible. Oh, no, you cannot disprove or prove. I have removed the Bible to an upper story where it's safe. Science is down here. The Bible is upstairs. Superhistory is upstairs. Science is downstairs. But you see, what are they simply doing? They are simply re-echoing that same old thing that started with Parmenides and Heraclitus long time ago, in which they're trying to develop some things, with Karl Barth on his end, that are true here, but not true there. In which you'd be schizophrenic and say, well, I'm a Christian, but at the same time, I believe in evolution and God didn't make the world. Well, how can you be both at the same time? Somebody say, well, I keep my science and my religion distinct. I keep my faith and my facts opposite. What is the end of this is simply where we have now with people like Sartre and Camus. You end up with the existentialists who are the end of the line. See, the existentialists were smart enough to see this. If meaning is not up there, and meaning is not in here, and meaning is not here, says the existentialist, there is no meaning. Is there any option left? If there's no world of ideas from which we can derive meaning for this podium, and we can't, with Aristotle, somehow grasp the essence and the meaning of this podium, and Kant was wrong, where the meaning is all in our head, then there is no meaning. And this is why we have today existentialism, who says there is no meaning. There is no knowledge, actually, of anything. Because they've run out of option. If it's not out there, in here, or in there, it's nowhere. So your existential theologians just simply say, like Kierkegaard said, I believe in nothing, capital N, O-T-H-I-N-G. Or I believe in the ridiculous, capital R. The leap of faith. You know what the leap of faith is? Believing something that is totally ridiculous and irrational simply because you want to. No meaning. No significance. And you see, this is all going back to the point that Parmenides and Heraclitus got their stuff together. Everybody has tried to reconcile it, and in the end you end up with total depression. No meaning. And as you begin your apologetics, whatever you do, you cannot begin with the idea that religion or Christianity can be separated from reality. You cannot make the Bible safe by removing it from the hard world of facts. If Christianity cannot survive the spades of the archaeologists, it does not deserve to survive. Let these things spark your ideas in terms of thinking through these things. We're going to be going into some more of the basic philosophic problems, but enough has been said to show you the basic dichotomy in humanistic thought, where it came from and where it has led to an absolute meaningless situation. Phenomenal has to do with phenomena, that which can be experienced, and the noumenal is that which can only be derived from the mind itself.
This is a Faith Defenders audio presentation.
Indeed, as you read the gospel accounts, you will find that Jesus Christ was eminently rational. He was not a wild-eyed fanatic or lunatic. Jesus Christ was factual, and he was ultimately biblical in his dialogues and monologues. He sought to deal with people. He dealt with their minds. He dealt with their reasoning abilities. This is perhaps one of the greatest problems we face in Christendom today. We have fallen into a phase in which preaching has been reduced to chills and thrills. People will go hear a sermon, and all they want to know is, did they get a blessing? I'll never forget in college that one speaker on a Tuesday in chapel spoke on Romans 7, saying that this was the normal Christian life in which there's a continual struggle. After the message was given, I went around as a philosophy student. I was intrigued by the lack of discernment on the part of students and faculty. And I says, what'd you think of the message? Oh, what a blessing. The next day, another speaker spoke on the same chapter and took the opposite position, that Romans 7 does not refer to the normal Christian life, but to a defeated Christian life until you get into Romans 8. So then I walked around and said, well, what did you think of it? Oh, what a blessing. They never recognized that the two men gave totally contradictory points and interpretations of that message. As a matter of fact, in an attempt to do some linguistic analysis of my own, I went around and asked Christians to define what they mean by the word blessing. What is blessing? You go read a book, what a blessing. Something happens. What is the blessing? Define it for me. The only ultimate definition I came up with from them is there were certain chills or thrills, an elation of the emotional state or attitude of the mind. Well, you see, this is the problem. When preaching is reduced to emotive manipulations, I want to make the people feel well today. I want them to feel happy. I want them to feel peaceful. Well, you see, when preaching is reduced to simply tampering with the emotional needs of people, you have short-circuited everything that the Apostle Paul and Jesus Christ ever stood for. When you attend church, you should have to use your mind. You should not, as some medieval theologian said, when you enter the church, leave the lantern of the mind on the hook outside the door. That's what they said. In other words, come into the church, don't expect to think. expect to feel. Have happy clap and feel. Either feel peaceful or comfortable. Don't think. And this is one of the greatest crimes today, is that many of the books on homiletics, on preaching, are so filled with the idea, preach to the emotions. Preach to the feelings of people. Preach to make them feel comfortable. Be positive. Never say anything that will cause them to be emotionally disturbed. I submit that as you read the Gospels and the Acts, you do not find that attitude and you do not find that approach to biblical truth. Fourthly, whatever you do as we approach the subject of apologetics, do not fall for the humanistic line that the Bible and biblical Christianity are to be viewed as non-rational or upper story. Now, this is a part that may be a little difficult to understand, but I think once you grasp this, many things will become clear to you. Humanistic thought begins with the assumption that all of life and knowledge can be understood on two levels. Two things which are mutually exclusive, but two things which you can hold somehow tenuously together. By lower story, I'm referring to those things which you view as rational, factual, logic, knowledge, has to do with science, has to do with matter, material reality, and with some form of determinism. Or, if you deal with the upper story, instead of talking about something that's rational, you say, well, this is non-rational. Instead of being factual, that is, it relates to hard, cold facts, well, we're talking about something that's non-factual. Or something that has to do with logic versus feelings. Knowledge versus belief. So some philosophers have said, well, religion only deals with belief. Science deals with knowledge. In religion, you believe. In science, you know. And you see, they have this dichotomy between knowledge and belief, between science and religion, between matter and ideas, between determinism and free will. And much today, I'm sorry to say, in terms of modern defenses of Christianity, many people are attempting to view Christianity as non-rational, non-factual, a matter of the feelings. It's a belief that has no basis in reality. It's religion. It has to do with ideas. And you see, it's upstairs. It's in the world of ideas. It has to do with things for which we don't have to defend themselves. This is why William James and even John Dewey said, when religion gets to the point that it cuts itself off from having to justify itself in the real world, then religion will go on triumphantly forever out of contact with reality. And you see, this is the position that people want to try to force us into. If you go to college, they say, well, we're dealing now with rational things. Don't bring up the Bible. We're dealing with logic, you see. We're dealing with science. We're dealing with knowledge. Don't bring up your speculations and your belief. And you see, they have in mind this basic dichotomy. And you've got to ask yourself, where did these things come from? Who started the idea that science is here, religion is here, that knowledge is here, and belief is here? Well, it all started back in the pre-Socratic, that is the age before Socrates and Plato, in the great golden age of Greece. The Greeks developed a philosophic dichotomy. Dichotomy means simply when you divide things in a hard and fast way. You have some people who talk about secular, and then they talk about sacred. They talk about knowledge. They talk about belief, science, religion. It's when you take something which in and of itself you believe to be a whole, but then you divide it and say that these two halves are qualitatively distinct from each other. And the Greeks developed a philosophic dichotomy as a reaction to two great Greek philosophers who lived before Socrates was born. The first Greek philosopher, and these two men that I'm going to mention this evening, are the father, basically, of all philosophic thought since their time. Alfred North Whitehead, one of the leading philosophers of the 20th century, put it this way, quote, "All of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato." Everything that has been written since the Socratic period must be viewed simply as a footnote to what was stated in this early period of Greek philosophy. There was a man by the name of Parmenides. He lived somewhere in the 6th and 5th century BC. He is noted particularly as being the father of rationalism and idealism. Rationalism and idealism. What do we mean by that? Well, you see, rationalism is the assumption that we can, within our own minds, develop a picture of reality without ever having to step outside and understand what reality is. That someone could, sitting in their room, rationally come up with an understanding of the world, of nature, of everything that is, of the universe, simply by thinking. You don't need to walk outside. Simply by thinking, by rational thought, you could come up with a correct understanding of the universe without any experience in the world. So the guy sitting at a desk in a tower is going to be able to understand what the world is all about. He doesn't need to step outside and see. Rationalism assumed reality will always correspond to what I think it is. Reality will always correspond to what I think it is. And you see, the rationalist is not concerned with going out and checking. The rationalist says, what is according to the way I think it is. The real is the rational. The rational is the real. And thus the great test of whether or not something is real to a rationalist is this: if I can rationally understand it, then it exists. If something is not rationally conceivable to me, it's not conceivable rationally to me, it does not exist. I don't care what you show me. If it, rationally speaking, I cannot understand it, I just can't believe it on rational grounds, then it does not exist. Now, Parmenides sat in his room and thought. And he thought about the subject of being. Being. There he is in his mind, and he came up with the following ideas. He said, first of all, rationally speaking, being can only be one. It's impossible to think that being could be anything else but one. Therefore, there are no particular things in this world. This podium is not separate from this pew. I am not separate from you. There are no particulars. There are no many things. There's only one thing: being. Secondly, this being will have to be perfect. It's inconceivable that being could be anything else than perfect. Thus, there is no imperfection in the world. There's no imperfection whatsoever. Being also is static. That is, it doesn't move and never changes. There is no such thing as rust or degeneration with being. Being must be eternal. By definition, being is not becoming, neither is it something that became. Being is, and always has been, and always will be. Sitting in his room, he said, being is one. Being is perfection. Being is static, nothing moving. Being is eternal. And being implies that you know it all or you don't know at all. Everyone knows everything at once or you know nothing at all. Because if you only know in part, you know nothing at all. So in his mind, reality is simply composed of being. No individual particularizations of that being allowed. One great being. This one great being is perfect. It is immutable, that it does not change. It is eternal. It is static. Now you take Parmenides outside and you say, hey, wait a second, Parmenides. You said reality is perfect. What about the crippled guy over here? That is illusion. There is no crippled guy. Well, what about the rust on this rock? There is no rust. Yeah, but look, Parmenides, I got a rock and I threw it in the air. Look, it hit over there. No, there is no motion. There is no rock to throw, and there is no motion of the rock moving from one place to the other. Because you see, rationally speaking, reality corresponds to what I think it is.